Hello again. I finally got some footage from some of my Auto 3s that I incorporated into the new introduction, which you're about to see. But hopefully I'll be able to get more footage from the Auto 3s, as the majority of them are currently working in the profession. So I'd like to share some of that footage with you, and hopefully in the near future we'll have the students back in the building and in the shop working on the things here, so you can see them do that as you have in past episodes. This was a relatively short video, as last week you saw when that tree was taken down. I've been pretty busy trying to get all that cleaned up and cut and split. But there is footage of the Harley fairing, which is done and back on the bike, and also rebuilt one of the brake calipers for the drag bike. The piece that I'm leaning on is the rear section of a 1923 Fortson tractor that my son McLean, who is currently a student at WVU, he was one of the primary players in working on this thing before he went off to school. And he'll be happy to know that I'm about to begin work on it again. So hopefully in next week's episode you'll see me putting the crankshaft back in the block so we can begin the process of getting this thing back together finally. Enjoy this week's episode. Putting the speedometer cable back into the housing here. If you look at the end, you can see it moving, turning back and forth as I'm turning the trigger portion of it on the wheel itself. I'll show you how we're going to anchor that later. But I do have it put back into the housing that I machined, and now all I have to do is tighten the set screw, and that'll hold it in place. And then we can start hooking up the other end of the cable, and then put the fairing on. So here's the set screw. Once I can get it started in there, and that's going to hold that portion of the cable tight inside that adapter, or the spacer rather. Now we can hook up the rest of it. I've got the speedometer cable routed now between the forks and up through the harnesses here. I've got it on the back of the speedometer itself. Get that screwed into place. Snug that down with some pliers, and then we're ready to go. The only thing left to do for the speedometer cable now is to take this bracket and mount it back to the fender so it holds it from flopping around. But I'm going to get some new hardware to do that. Before I put the fairing back on, I want to make sure I get all of this debris cleaned out of here. That was from just from many years of sitting, I guess. Once we pulled the fairing off, there was a lot of that there, and if you remember, there was a mouse nest in there as well. We've got all that cleaned up now. We're going to get this all cleaned out. Then we'll be able to bolt the fairing back on and see what this thing looks like. I've got the headlight assembly set back down onto the fairing. I'm going to tighten it down with its screws. I'm not going to put the accent ring around the headlight because I'm going to replace the headlight itself. Because number one, it's a little foggy here from age, but it's also got that goofy Harley symbol in the middle of it. I'm trying to get rid of as much of that stuff as I possibly can. Before I can put the fairing back on, I need to get this series of lights mounted back first as the fairing goes over top of it. But before I do that, I'm getting rid of more of these ridiculous Harley emblem pieces. I've got these shield pieces, or whatever you want to call them, that go over top of each one of the lights. They even put them on the turn signals. So I'm getting rid of this nonsense. It's going to look so much cleaner without it, including these down there. Once I get all that done, we'll set that back up on the bike, then we'll be ready to put the fairing on. The light bar is in place. I've got the electrical connector hooked up, but I have them laying here on a stack of rags on the fender so it doesn't scratch that. But I have to put the fairing on first. But I had to lay those there because I wouldn't be able to reach the electrical connector. So now that that's done, I'll put the fairing on, but then the light bar goes on after that. I'll get my fairing wound up first. I'm going to secure it with the two bottom bolts. Do that on both sides, just loosely. Then after I do that, I'll be able to put the light bar on, and then the whole whole front end will be done except for the headlight ramp. With the fairing secure, I took the two bottom bolts back out, and now I'm going to take the light bar and get it in position, and then put those two bottom bolts back in, and that's going to secure the lights and the fairing. Be really careful. Don't do any damage to my paint. Both these have to come around the outside of the fairing, and up through and behind it. The two bottom fairing bolts hold the bottom of the bar, and there's two bolts on the inside of the fairing that hold the top part of the light bracket. Got all the bolts snugged up, and we can move on to something else. The two saddlebags for the Harley are ready to prime, so we'll get these primed, blocked out, and then these will be ready to paint blue along with the tops. Okay, that's one good coat. We'll do that 2 more times, and we'll be ready to let them dry and get them wet sanded. The pull start and the fuel tank are all one piece on this larger unit. So I've got it pulled apart here. And the what engages with the flywheel are these two fingers here. There's 2 on each side. I'm not sure if that's because it's a bigger engine and it needs both of them to do it, or if whichever one happens to hit it hits it. But they're free, but I'm going to pull it apart and clean it anyway, because they might just be dragging a little bit in the initial pull. So anyway, we'll get that. We'll pull this E-clip out of there, pop that cap off there, clean it up, and see if it works better. Pull start's working good now, so I'll pull it for you a couple times so you can hear it. What you're listening for is a click. That clicking noise are the drives for the flywheel expanding out against spring pressure to actually engage and start the saw. So see if you can hear it. Okay, so that's the clicking noise. So now all I gotta do is put this back together, put it back on the saw, and it should be fine. A couple of weeks ago, you saw my oldest son riding my drag bike around, and we told you that the brakes needed to be gone through. I've got the rear caliper off with a kit, and so we're going to pull this apart and get it rebuilt. The first thing we need to do is get the pads out, so we're going to take out these clips here. And that will allow us to get the pins out. And the pads will come right out the top. I've got the caliper set in a vise. I've got a rag between the 2 pistons. I'm going to blast a little bit of air in here now to get the pistons to come out. Hopefully it won't make too much mess. And it will move. One of them will move. Alright, one of the pistons moved at least, because the rag is stuck between the pistons. We'll be able to get that out without too much trouble. We'll move that back just a little bit, get the rag out of the way. And there we see, actually both pistons looks like they've moved, and that's pretty awesome. So now what we're going to do is pull and push these out. Get it walked out nice and easy. So we've got room hopefully to get the piston out. We're not worried about messing up the rubber. We've got all new seals and boots in the kit. We just need to be able to get these pushed out. Oops, we'll get that pushed back over there. That should give us enough room to get this piston out. Like so. Now it doesn't matter which one goes where, but I am going to keep them separate inside to outside. Case it matters, but I know that in this particular one it does not. We'll just keep working this back and forth, get the piston pulled out, not doing any damage to the piston where it would seal. This is just where the dust boot grabs it. Oh, there we go. So now we've got this one out of the way, put that one where it belongs. We'll just clean up the rest of the brake fluid that we have. We'll get the dust seals and the boots out of the way. Alright, we don't need those anymore. Now inside, I don't know that I'm going to be able to show you this, but I'm going to try. There's a square cut O-ring in here that creates our seal. I'm going to try to stay out of your way, use this pocket screwdriver to grab the seal like that and get it pulled out. Alright, so there we can see that seal, and that's going to be brand new as well. Kind of curious about the fact that this O-ring actually still feels pretty good. So I'm going to be looking at the hose to make sure that it hasn't imploded, because that could have been causing the same problem. But since we're going to start racing this thing again, it's a good idea to replace all these and get both calipers rebuilt and just go through the whole brake system, because when you're going that fast, that quick, you do want to stop eventually. So we'll go ahead and take out the other seal, get everything cleaned up, and start putting it back together. We're also going to be pulling the caliper apart. Since there's a piston on both sides, fluid has to pass through the caliper to get to the outboard piston. So we're going to be taking these fasteners loose, and then what we're going to find is there's passages with O-rings that we're also going to want to replace as part of the rebuild. That's also going to allow us easier access to the bore, so we can clean it up a lot better. Before putting the pistons back in with the new seal, we want to make sure they're nice and clean, that there's no imperfections on here, any cuts, chips, rust, or anything like that before we put it in. This one looks really good. If it doesn't, then that can cause it to leak a little bit, or worse, it can snag the seal and cut the seal, and then you won't have any brakes at all. So both these pistons look really good, so we're ready to put them back together and put them back into service. Got both halves of the caliper cleaned out really well with some brake clean. We're taking our new seal here and putting it in. There we go. We've got the piston cleaned up as well. What I'm going to do is take a little bit of brake fluid and just lubricate the seal. You do not want to use oil or anything. These are meant to be in brake fluid, so you only want to use brake fluid to lubricate these. And then we're going to get our piston pushed in nice and even, like so. It went in very nice. Then we're going to take our new dust seal and get it over the piston here and on the outside of the housing there. So as the piston moves in and out, this will flex like an accordion and keep it sealed, or keep dirt and water out. It doesn't keep the fluid in. That's what the O-ring is for, inside. So we'll get this wrapped around here, and then we're going to do the same thing to the other side. Then we can put the two halves together. With both caliper halves back together with the new seals and boots and the pistons clean, we're ready to assemble both halves. I've got my new O-ring here to put there, so it creates our seal between the two. So what we're going to do, we have to be really careful with this to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere when we bring the two halves together. I've got my two bolts ready to go back in as well. What I am going to do is just kind of soak this in a little bit of brake fluid that I have laying here. Okay, looks like we are there. I'm going to double check it. Yes, the brake fluid actually is going to help hold that seal in place. Just like that. Alright, so now we'll put the two bolts back in. And then when I draw these down, that is going to collapse that O-ring. So it creates a nice tight seal, because there'll be a lot of pressure on there every time we press the brake pedal. Okay. Alright, with both halves tight, now we can put our pads back in and get those locked back in place. And then this thing will be ready to mount back onto the bike. Caliper's all back together, the pads are in place with the vibration clips and the pins. So we'll get this back on the bike, get it bled out, and then we'll get that front one taken off and rebuild it. Next time on Bulldog Builds, we'll have some blue paint put on those Harley saddlebags. We'll have the rear brake caliper on and the front brake caliper off the drag bike, and hopefully we'll have some work done on that 23 Fordson. See you next week.